President of the Senate of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Senator the Honorable Nigel de Freitas, Minister of National Security in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Fitzgerald Ethelbert Hines, Member of Parliament, High Commissioners and Ambassadors accredited to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean territories, President of the Caribbean Court of Justice, the Honorable Mr. Justice Adrian Saunders. I do have Independent Senator in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Anthony Vieira, Senior Counsel. Heads of regional and international organizations, including representatives of one of our co-sponsors, CARICOM Impacts, that's the implementing agency for crime and security, Ms. Tonya Ayau, Deputy Executive Director of Impacts, presenter, Ms. Dawn Spicer, Executive Director of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, fondly known as CFATF, Judge and Chairman of the Tax Appeal Court, the Honorable Dr. Anthony Gafour, other representatives of embassies accredited to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean countries, Professor Ivelaw Griffith, our esteemed author for today's book launch, other senior government officials and heads of departments of government agencies in the Ministry of National Security, presenter Mr. Dale Joseph, Chief Analyst on Cybersecurity at CARICOM Impacts. I do recognize several heads of divisions in the Ministry of National Security, Air Vice Marshal Darrell Daniel, Chief of Defense Staff of the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Commissioner of Police, Ms. Erla Harewood Christopher, Commissioner of Police in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Major General Retired Rodney Smart, Chief Executive Officer of the Organization for Disaster Preparedness and Management, fondly called the ODPM. Good evening to you, sir. Heads of universities, academic institutes, and centers. I do recognize my friend, Dr. Diane Douglas, Defense Force consultant, and certainly the very distinguished Professor Clement Imbert, Chairman of the Board of the University of Trinidad and Tobago, and representative of the co-sponsor, the University of the West Indies Institute of International Relations, in particular, its acting director, Dr. Anita Montut, heads of private sector and private security organizations, heads of civil society organizations, professors emeriti, current and former faculty, including Professor Compton Bourne, and presenters, distinguished Professor Andy Knight, who is online, Professor Wendy Grenard, Dr. Wendell C. Wallace, my good friend, and Dr. Georgina Shami, who is also online. U.W.I alumni and students, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. That's a long salutation. I trust that those who come after me may afford themselves the opportunity to observe all protocols, particularly because we have quite a packed but impactful evening on the agenda. I trust that you all have copies of the program, so it should be easy for you to follow us. And may I say a special welcome to our virtual audience, who I understand are hailing from a number of countries around the world. And as we know, the question of security is international, to which I'm sure those who are more qualified than I am will certainly get into it at the appropriate time. So as chairperson for this evening, I have the distinct honor of being the time police. And I know that the commissioners of police is sitting here, so she briefed me appropriately just before the event started. So in this regard, I want to, first of all, ask the Honorable Minister of National Security in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to give his remarks as one of the co-sponsors for this event. Honorable Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Major Richard Lynch, for your very kind introduction in your capacity as Master of Ceremonies / moderator of this very important event. President of the Senate of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Senator the Honorable Nigel de Freitas, Your Excellencies, representatives of the Diplomatic Corps, the Honorable Mr. Justice Adrian Saunders, President of the Caribbean Court of Justice, all of the heads and representatives of the regional and international organizations present, in particular CARICOM Impacts, and of course, the University of the West Indies as co-sponsors of this event. And from here, I think it would be safe to say, let me recognize Professor Ivelaw Griffith, the author of the book that will be launched here today, and of course, Ivelaw Griffith, his equally distinguished son, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Taking a cue from the moderator, I stand on the already established protocol in this regard. I take this opportunity to sincerely congratulate you, Professor Griffith, on your very scholarly work entitled Challenged Sovereignty, the Impact of Drugs, Crime, Terrorism, and Cyber Threats in the Region, which I understand to be the latest in a body of work that spans across some 4 decades of thought leadership and academic offerings on regional and hemispheric security. This is worthy of particular recognition and celebration, particularly for the fact that as a son, a proud son of this region, Professor Griffith has remained internationally regarded, respected, and relevant, possessed of the necessary understanding of, and able to offer prescriptions on the business of the multidimensional nature and impact of security in the region, its implications for regional governance, inclusive of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and in his own words, geo-narcotics. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, when I was first presented with the proposal for the Ministry of National Security to join the University of the West Indies and CARICOM Impacts, and of course the Caribbean Policy Consortium in co-hosting this event, I must confess that my decision-making inputs was organized around my own understanding of Trinidad and Tobago's shared interest with the region on the very critical matter of our collective regional security. To this end, Trinidad and Tobago, like most Caribbean small island dependent states, or as some would say, We are more accurately described as large ocean states. We are ocean-dependent or sea-locked societies. We are economically dependent on the exploitation of surrounding coastal waters with significant concentrations of population and infrastructure in coastal areas, inclusive of non-surface energy, resources, and minerals. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as I pondered on Trinidad and Tobago's shared assets with the region, I could not escape the commonality of the threat environment in which we live, work, and operate with the rest of the region, of course. At the domestic level, Trinidad and Tobago is confronted for some time past, a long time, with 7 what we call enduring threats: narco-trafficking, small arms and ammunition trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism, cyber attacks, climate change, and global health pandemics, some of which are the focus of the work that we launch here today. But what is unique in respect of these threats is the fact that their generative factors originate largely outside of the region, external to the region, notwithstanding their very severe impact upon all of us, every one of us. For a few examples, the narcotics that afflict us in real ways in the region are largely produced in South American continental states, and more lately in laboratories across North America, Europe, and elsewhere. The small arms are manufactured predominantly outside of the Caribbean region, largely in the United States, as we have come to understand. Human beings are predominantly trafficked from the South American states. And though trafficking can be, but although this is a large part of the problem, the point I make is that trafficking can be largely and wholly domestic as well, as Trinidad and Tobago's first conviction for the human trafficking offense, which transpired a few months ago, involved the accused, now convicted, who was Trinidadian. His victim was a 15-year-old Trinidadian girl. The facts and circumstances transpired in Trinidad, and of course, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in a Trinidad jail. Very domestic in that regard. The matters of terrorism rooted in the policy and process of returning persons from external conflict zones and the effectiveness of and the balancing of our national and regional security interests with that of human rights and humanitarianism in other parts of the world. And of course, cyber attacks against our critical cyber infrastructure, increasingly a feature of transnational organized crime committed by actors largely external to the region. This is, of course, a real and growing and threatening phenomenon. The nature of these enduring threats call for furtherance of a commensurate framework of increased regional cooperation and integration based on the existence of strong legislative frameworks and the use of an integrated whole of government, whole of country, whole of region response. This therefore renders cooperation among us and collaboration with our international partners and a predominantly intermestic framework of governance to be critical to any enduring responses or attempts at treating with the multidimensional issue of the safety and security of the region. Another of Professor Griffith's contributions to the discourse in his concept of security itself is in his work entitled The Quest for Security in the Caribbean, published in 1993, where he took the position that security is essentially protection and preservation of a people's freedom from external military attack and coercion, from internal subversion and the corrosion of cherished political, economic, and social values, and that these values include democratic choice and political stability in the political arena, sustainable development, and free enterprise in the economic domain, and social equality and respect for human rights in the social arena. This definition, which influenced my curiosity about the book and the discourse here this evening, is part of my own broader deliberation on what is meant and how it impacts upon us, this question of multidimensional security. There is no doubt that the threats are multidimensional and the responses must be equal to that. Questions arise. To what extent does the erosion of our social, economic, and political values and objectives have impacted negatively or positively on our experience of security or insecurity, as the case may be? It's one question. Esteemed guests, if you agree with me, and I'm sure you will, it is not often we get an opportunity to come away from the regular daily work that we pursue to sit together in a forum like this, where you have a collection, a platform of thought leaders, policy advisors, and practitioners, as we commit to applying our experience and expertise to this complex convergence of the security and its impact for our sovereignty, the threats and its impact for our sovereignty in the region. The Ministry of National Security is therefore particularly delighted to be a part of this launch, to be a part of this initiative. And it is my hope that this evening's deliberations on the content of this work, Challenged Sovereignty, will serve as yet another catalyst for rich thought leadership and executive imperatives for implementation. For me, as I remember the good old adage, that if you win the intellectual battle, the politics will come a lot easier. And I consider, therefore, that the ideas that will come from this kind of intellectual discourse and from the work of Professor Griffith should be a guide, ought to be a guide to us policymakers. And on that basis alone, I especially welcome this work, Professor. Hard work, integrity, ambition, education, family life, and a sense of autonomy are the hallmarks and foundation of our lives here in the Caribbean. There remains a persistent and undying faith and hope in us as a people and as a region, who have the potential to realize any and everything that is great, any and everything that is the best version of ourselves, and the very best of who and what we are as a Caribbean people. I was at the Hyatt this morning to witness the launch of a two-day symposium designed to produce ideas and action for the regeneration of West Indian cricket, a very important platform that unites the Caribbean and is itself apparently under threat. This book launch this evening is no different in its inspiration to me. And therefore, as Minister of National Security, it is my distinct honor and pleasure not only to have welcomed every one of you, but to encourage us all to drink lavishly from the professor's offerings this evening and to let the thoughts and ideas that flow from them influence our own thoughts, our own actions, our decision-making for the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago and, of course, the people of the region. May this evening's deliberations, therefore, lead to a safer and more secure Trinidad and Tobago and region. I thank you.
So with the introductory remarks by the Honorable Minister of National Security, or more so the quality of its content, is a foreshadow of what is to come by the persons who are tasked to comment on the book itself. My intellectual appetite is certainly stirred. I hope it's the same with all of you. In this regard, I want to invite to the podium at this time Ms. Tonya Ivelaw. Ms. Tonya Ivelaw is a very good friend of mine. We've worked together quite often, and in her capacity as the Executive Director of CARICOM Impacts, she has worked in the region for over 15 years, holding key positions as Director, Assistant Director of Support Services, Head of the Secretariat, before becoming Deputy Executive Director just about 3-4 years ago. I take this opportunity, therefore, to welcome my good friend Tonya, who will give opening remarks on behalf of CARICOM Impacts as one of the co-sponsors. Ms. Ivelaw.
Thank you very much, Major Lynch. And while I pull up the speech, let me start by saying that it is indeed an honor to be here today, to be part of this book launch, that I have a little story to share. When I was doing my master's at Boston University let me not say the year, because then I will lose the claim of 36 years now. But at that time, I was studying international relations with a focus on national security. And at the time, my thesis or dissertation would have been on Plan Colombia. And at that time, we were given journals or articles and so. And I was particularly impressed this one day when I was given the book to read, Drugs and Security in the Caribbean. And I was even more impressed when I saw Dr. Ivelaw Griffith, who was from the English-speaking Caribbean, because a lot of times we get these journals, these articles from external persons, from Americans, from the South Americans, etc. But very few times in the US universities we got to experience, to read the articles, the journals, or the work of English-speaking Caribbean, speaking Caribbean persons. So, sir, before I start the official part of my speech, I want to say thank you for giving many of us a shoulder to stand on. Because of people like yourself, specifically you, many of us are here today to be able to be practitioners in the field because you gave us that shoulder, that knowledge, and for that we're truly grateful. So, observing all protocols, I want to say that on behalf of the Executive Director, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Jones, who is unable to be with us here today, we at CARICOM Impacts wish to express our sincere thanks and appreciation to Professor Griffith for blessing us with this insightful book on the Caribbean security, aptly titled Challenged Sovereignty, the Impact of Drugs, Crime, Terrorism, and Cyber Threats in the Caribbean. It is a great honor and pleasure to really participate in this launch. I heartily congratulate you, sir, on behalf of all the staff at Impact, for your distinguished academic record exemplified by this landmark publication, among others. Thank you for endeavoring to articulate more clearly and more forcefully the issues relating to Caribbean security. The timing of this event is highly appropriate. It is of great coincidence, but some of you may remember that tomorrow, 26 April 2023, will be the first anniversary of the CARICOM Impacts and Small Arms Survey launch of our flagship report entitled Caribbean Firearms Study. And the reason that I bring that up is because in your chapter, The Crucible of Crime, chapter 4 of this book, the broader conclusions and recommendations of the Caribbean Firearms Study form a considerable part of the rigorous and meticulous analysis of your publication. I must admit, and you made me read because I could not come up here without reading, that the book is a treasure trove of Caribbean security dynamics and a seminal contribution to the development of Caribbean security within a global environment of significant upheaval, interlocking crises, which are triggering profound uncertainty for what the future holds. Through your intellectual labor, sir, you have reflected in this book the frontiers of analytical thinking beyond the often descriptive analysis of drugs, crime, terrorism, and cybersecurity, firmly placing the issues of problems without passports at the center of analysis and the impact, interrelationships, and the implications for state sovereignty in the region. The publication is undoubtedly a major contribution that will be a must-read by security practitioners and scholars of security studies. And I do hope that our national, regional, and international universities make at least a chapter or two compulsory reading. The contextual analysis of Caribbean security will contribute significantly to a better understanding of the region, help to inform responses to our security challenges, and guide improved national and regional policy, and ultimately assist with policy actions and operational components. Like all your other publications, I am certain that this one will generate great dialogue and debate on the challenges identified. In that way, the publication will help CARICOM member states adjust to the changing national, regional, and international security landscape in ways that will advance the region's national security interests. CARICOM Impacts will continue to be part of this dialogue. We wish to continue to be part of this dialogue and a strong advocate for increased publications on Caribbean security. In closing, sir, and to all here, please allow me to congratulate you again, Professor Griffith, on yet another important contribution to Caribbean security. And as the minister has said, and as Major Lynch has said, I too am eager to listen to other presenters and the proceeding discussion on the publication's analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Next up is the third of the three co-sponsors for this evening's event, and that's the University of the West Indies, represented, of course, by its dynamic acting director, Dr. Anita Montoute. Dr. Montoute holds a doctorate in philosophy and international relations, which she earned in 2009. And I have known Dr. Montoute for quite a number of years. I sat at her academic feat for many occasions. I remember in particular a course on global governance. It cost me a lot of sleepless nights. So it takes me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Montoute at this time to give co-sponsor remarks on behalf of the University of the West Indies. Dr. Montoute.
Thank you very much, Chair, for your kind remarks and introduction. President of the Senate, Senator the Honorable Nigel de Freitas, Minister of National Security, the Honorable Fitzgerald Hines, High Commissioners and Ambassadors accredited to Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean countries, President of the Caribbean Court of Justice, the Honorable Mr. Justice Adrian Saunders, Independent Senator of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Anthony Vieira, heads of regional and international organizations, including representative of co-sponsor CARICOM Impacts, Ms. Tonya Ayau, Professor Ivelaw Griffith, distinguished scholar and author of Challenge Sovereignty, the Impact of Drugs, Crime, Terrorism, and Cyber Threats in the Caribbean. Esteemed presenters, friends and well-wishers, I see many of you in the audience, students, ladies and gentlemen. I am extremely honored to bring remarks and greetings from the Institute of International Relations and by extension, the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. We are indeed pleased to be a co-sponsor along with the Ministry of National Security, CARICOM Impacts, and the Caribbean Policy Consortium for the launch of this timely, relevant, and significant scholarly work authored by Professor Ivelaw Griffith. Congratulations and thank you, Professor Griffith, and our esteemed partners for the wonderful collaboration. In keeping with the Institute's mandate, we host various kinds of events intended to promote discussion, exchange of ideas on a range of issues of relevance to the international relations of the Caribbean and regional development. These include diplomatic dialogues, panel discussions, guest lectures, and book launches such as this one. Sometimes we execute events collaboratively with individuals as well as organizations, private sector organizations, research and policy bodies, national and regional governmental and non-governmental organizations, the diplomatic corps, as well as civil society groups. Today, we are happy for this four-way collaboration. We are particularly pleased to be associated with a publication on security-related issues of the region authored by the most distinguished scholar on this subject. Issues related to peace and security are critical to the overall development of the Caribbean region. More specifically, goal number 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals, promoting just, peaceful, and inclusive societies, is seen to be foundational for the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. However, significant challenges remain with SDG 16 in many developing countries, including the Caribbean, bringing relevance to this discussion we are having here today. According to the September 2023 Global Progress Index report on Sustainable Development, Goal 16 indicators, a wake-up call for action on peace, justice, and inclusion, quote, human rights commitments are not being met, violence is increasing, inequality continues to hinder inclusive decision-making, and corruption erodes the social fabric, end of quote. According to the Global Peace Index 2023, 18 of the 20 most dangerous countries are in the Global South. A 2021 IDB report states that crime is a major problem in Latin America and the Caribbean, having 9% of the world's population accounting for 33% of global homicides. In 2023, the UNDP reported, quote, the lack of citizen security in Latin America and the Caribbean has long been considered an important factor hindering development in the region. Recent data show that although homicides have decreased in many countries in recent years, the Latin American and Caribbean regions remain the most violent region in the world, with crime consistently above epidemic levels, end of quote. Therefore, it is imperative that we give every attention to security issues in individual countries, the region, and globally. As I end, I wish to congratulate Professor Griffith again on this landmark achievement, wishing everyone an enjoyable event. And the chair is permitting me to go straight into introducing our distinguished scholar, academic, and the author of this landmark publication, Professor Ivelaw Lloyd Griffith. Center for Strategic and International Studies Senior Associate, Ivelaw Lloyd Griffith also is a fellow with the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Global Americans. He has published widely on Caribbean issues, including the books Strategy and Security in the Caribbean, The Quest for Security in the Caribbean, Drugs and Security in the Caribbean, Democracy and Human Rights in the Caribbean, The Political Economy of Drugs in the Caribbean, Caribbean Security in the Age of Terror and Challenge Sovereignty. Recipient of the Perry Award for Excellence in Security and Defense Education, conferred by the Perry Center of National Defense University. Ivelaw has served as Vice Chancellor of the University of Guyana, President of Fort Valley State University in Georgia, Provost of universities in Virginia and New York, and as a Dean of Florida International University. Also, he has testified before the U.S. Congress on Caribbean security issues and has been visiting scholar of military institutes in Canada, Germany, and the United States. He and his wife of 4 decades have 2 adult children and 1 granddaughter. Thank you very much. Professor Griffith.
Good evening. That's not a Trini response. Good evening. We're almost there. Let's try it one more time. Good evening. No, that's a real Caribbean response. I am always delighted to come back to the region. Some of you may not know, but this is the second book launch in Trinidad I've been at in 6 months. I was here last November for the launch of Professor Winston Ducaran's. Winston, wave your hand. Outstanding book. But I want to tell you, and we can go to the next slide, I want to tell you that a book that Tonya referred to, and I think Anita also referred to, I wrote almost 3 decades ago, called Drugs and Security in the Caribbean, Sovereignty Under Siege. I was here in Trinidad about 3 decades ago for a book tour on that book. I don't know if Anthony Philip Spencer, the ambassador, is here. Tony, are you here? He's on his way. But I'll tell you a story about that book. When Tony Philip Spencer gets here, he will be only one of two people who were in Trinidad for that occasion in 1998. Now, Don is wondering who's the second person. The second person is my son. I call him Ivelaw the Younger. He was 10 years old. The remarkable thing about that visit to Trinidad in 1998 was the educational horizons that it provided to my kids. And I only realized the value of that visit in educational terms when about a year later on, Ivelaw, doing a project for one of his classes, said, "Daddy, can you read this project report?" And there I saw Ivelaw explaining what he learned in the Caroni swamps, the ecological value. And so I want to publicly thank Tony Philip Spencer, who was at the time ADC to President Robinson, who organized for my wife and the kids. While I was out talking about this book, the kids and my wife were getting a broadening of their educational perimeter. In his absence, let's thank Tony Philip Spencer for that. But I'm delighted not only to be here again, but to see several familiar faces and to express my appreciation for your attending. You know, as you're getting old, you can't see everybody, especially when the lighting is not great. But I'm delighted to recognize the president of the CCJ. Did an outstanding lecture when I was at a University of Guyana as Vice Chancellor, had him come over and we had dinner, the wonderful job. Thank you, Adrian, for that job that you did way back when. Can't forget Winston. Thank you, Winston, for being here, and many other colleagues. Sheridan was one of the few Trinidadians at my inauguration as Vice Chancellor. Sheridan, thank you for being here. I thought I saw Ansel Antoine. I got to tell you a story about Ansel. For a number of years, I used to have these treks to Washington to do things with National Defense University, State Department. And there was one occasion when, and Ansel may not remember this, the guys took me for a drink, a lime, after my official lecture, and all of us forgot the time. So by the time I got to the airport, my flight had left. So I had to spend the night with Ansel at his home. I think Tony was there, Polo was there. We had a wonderful time, and I don't ever forget those special moments when things didn't go as planned, but I was able to get a flight the next day to go back to Miami. Thank you, Ansel, for being there and for being here. There is a dynamic group of people who I'd like you to applaud in extremis. The group of people who organize, along with their staffs, this event of which we're participants this evening. One of those people in the dynamic trio is Major Richard Lynch. Give him a round of applause. Another person in that trio is Dr. Anita Montoot. Give her a round of applause. And there's a gentleman who could not be here because he's traveling on business, Calixtus Joseph. Sometimes he's on the plane, he's at the airport, we're having these meetings. Calixtus is on the phone. You know, I only have to be in the phone, I can't join video. Let's give Calixtus a round of applause for the impact, the work he did on impacts. But I also want to thank our colleagues who are joining us online for your participation. Hopefully you'll be able to buy 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 copies of the book afterwards. You know, it's still available on Amazon if you're not here to buy it in person. I think it's more than appropriate that the Caribbean launch of this book is taking place in Trinidad and Tobago. Wendell is wondering why. Well, I'll tell you why, Wendell. When we go to the next slide, you'll see that this book has its genesis in connections to Trinidad and Tobago that you may not be aware of. We all know of this intellectual giant called Eric Williams, not only a political giant, but an intellectual giant. And many of you may know of a woman called Erica Connell Williams, who is an indefatigable purveyor and enabler of memories of Eric's work, of his life, his legacy. And there was a lecture series established, the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture Series, to honor the memory and celebrate the intellectual and social contributions of Eric Williams. And in 2011, Erica asked me to deliver the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture for that year. I had left FIU, where the lecture series had begun. I was then a provost at the university in New York, but I was delighted to go back to FIU, to Florida, to deliver that lecture. And you'll see a copy of the front page, Drugs and Crime as Problems Without Power Sports in the Caribbean. How secure is security? How sovereign is sovereignty? The discourse at that lecture was substantive, intriguing. Many people asked me to do something with this lecture, but it was, you know, sometimes political scientists have a way of writing long things. The lecture I wrote was almost 100 pages, Minister, and I therefore didn't want to attempt to publish it as an article in the journal. And so I toyed with the idea of making a book out of it, largely because of encouragement by people who had read online the lecture and participated in the lecture at FIU itself. But you know, those of us who are family people, you've got to be mindful of what your wife wants. And we had been moving around the United States, spending all this time writing books. And my wife said, honey, not another book. You're not writing another book. All this time you've gone writing this book. And so she threw legitimately cold-shouldered the idea until one day in San Francisco, we had an event and she said, well, honey, when are you going to finish that book? I was pleasantly surprised at the permission given by my wife then. And I got back into it. And although it took me more than the time I anticipated, I actually was supposed to deliver the book to the publisher in 2013, Minister. But as they say, life happens. I didn't get to finish the book until 2021. So it is appropriate, it is fitting, it's delightful that the first launch in the Caribbean is happening at a place where the genesis of the book had to do with Eric Eustace Williams. Next slide, please. Erica couldn't be here. I sent her a copy of the book. She's in Miami. Winston, you might remember I used the same framework when I presented in your book. You know, in high school, I had a teacher who taught Latin and maths, Ms. Dunbar. And she introduced us to a mathematician called Bertrand Russell. It was not until I got to university I realized that Bertrand Russell was not only a mathematician, he was also a philosopher. He was one of those 20th century Renaissance men, reflective in the fact that his Nobel Prize was for literature. So he was in philosophy, he was in mathematics, he was in literature. And for many years now, I've used a recommendation that Bertrand Russell gave as a way of framing conversations. And this is what Bertrand Russell said. Sometimes it's a healthy thing to hang a question mark on things you have long taken for granted, especially if you don't know much about those things. And so what I thought I would do is to hang 3 question marks on what this study is all about. We'll spend a few minutes first talking about what are the aims of the book? What is the architecture of the book? We'll do that in like 2-3 minutes, which is like 5 regular minutes. And then we'll take maybe another 5-20 minutes, which is like 8 or 9. Right, Don? To go to the second question mark. And then we'll finish the interrogation by looking at what are some of the main findings of the study. Next slide, please. This is the point at which, Richard, I'll take that portable mic. When you get a chance to read the book, you'll see that there are 6 aims. There are 6 aims in the study. I'll allow you a chance to peruse some of them. But a critical aim, number 6, is to ponder this question. How secure is the security of the region? And how sovereign is the sovereignty of the region? And pondering that question comes out of examining these problems without passports, the drugs, the crime, the terrorism, the cyber threats, and doing so in a way that allows us to see not only the reality of some of these problems without passports having domestic manifestation, as the minister said, but having a regional connectivity. 6 aims of the study. Now, when we go to the next slide, the question is, well, what might we say about the structure of this book, the architecture of the book? I think it's important to put works that you write in a framework, a schema that is as easily understood and read as possible. And so I organized the book into 4 sections. One looking at the context and the concepts. You've got to start with conceptual frameworks and explanatory notions of what the issues are. And then we go to look at these 4 problems without passports: the drugs, the crime, the terrorism, the cyber threats. But I think it's important, and you'll see when you have a chance to peruse the book, I think there's value in not only having regional analyses, but also case studies. And so there are case studies in the book. You'll see the final bullet identifies the case studies, one dealing with Trinidad and Tobago. I spent a good deal of chapter 6, I think, looking at the 2011 state of emergency that was declared here in Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the people who I acknowledge in the preface of the book, a good friend who could not be here tonight, then Minister of National Security, John Sandy. I remember John and I were emailing 2 days before I left to go to Miami to give the lecture, providing me with updated data on some of the outcomes, the consequences of that state of emergency. So there's, in my vantage point, thank you, there's a rich conversation, rich discourse. In one of the cases about Trinidad and Tobago's combination of realities, the drugs, the crime, the armed gang operations that precipitated the declaration of a state of emergency. But one might say that before 2011 was 2010. And the 2010 revolves around the case in Jamaica, the Dudus extradition case. We'd love to see by a show of hands, how many of you remember the trauma on Jamaica and the region by that episode where the police and the citizens were battling, where citizens were protecting the dons. I still remember some of the headlines. After Christ come Dudus. There's an extensive examination in a case study, the situation in Jamaica in 2010, and what lessons might we learn going forward in how Jamaica handled that, the fallout politically, the fallout security-wise of that case. But not only is there a rich, in my view, discourse by way of narrative, I'm very big on providing hard data, evidence. And so you'll find interspersed throughout the book tables and graphs and sidebars, little more than 40 of them, helping to make real some of the evidence of what is in there. But I also thought, since the Dudus episode was so traumatic for not only Jamaica, but the region, maybe I should spend some time reflecting the treaty that was the fulcrum around which the controversy between Jamaica and the United States revolved. The United States and Jamaica signed a treaty on extradition in 1983. That treaty was the basis for America's request to the government of Jamaica for extradition of Dudus. Now, the treaty was a signal part of the discourse, the narrative, the experience. But when you read the letter of transmittal from President Reagan at the time to the Senate, in the American context, treaties have got to be ratified. The president sends the treaty to the Senate, and he sends a letter of transmittal. Here is what this is all about. Here's why it's important. President Reagan explained that that treaty was the model they were going to use for other extradition treaties. It happens that Jamaica was the first place it was signed for. So that treaty was not only a model for the Caribbean, it was a model of extradition treaty the United States was making, period. And they've used it in many other jurisdictions. And that was a treaty that was the basis for America's request for Christopher Dudus Coke to be extradited. It set the stage for a whole series of dramatic developments in Jamaica that had consequences, one of which was the Prime Minister lost his job less than 2 years after the episode. So you find that treaty there as part of the book, part of the architecture. Let's go to the next slide. And the next slide is the slide that responds. Minister asked me early before we began, what is the central thesis of the book? And as I explained to the minister, my central argument is if you were to take the drugs, the crime, the terrorism, and the cyber challenges as a package, the dynamics between and among them, the implications of their consequences, means that the sovereignty of our region's states is challenged. And I give the evidence of how the challenge manifests itself in several different chapters. The threats posed by drugs, crime, and other problems without passports have been exacerbating the vulnerability of Caribbean states, pushing their ships of security into turbulent seas and presenting a circumstance of challenged sovereignty. Next slide, please. And you'll find that in terms of what are the main propositions of this book, I offer a definition. You remember there was a French philosopher called Voltaire. Voltaire was known for driving people crazy because he used to say, before we begin our conversation, monsieur, we've got to define our terms. So following Voltaire's admonition, I define what I mean by challenged sovereignty. And by challenged sovereignty, I mean a condition where a state's vulnerability is exacerbated by internal and external developments that compromise the ability of supreme authority of the state to promulgate and to execute both domestic and foreign policy in its own deliberate judgment and on its terms. If you're minded to be scientifically oriented and you want a formula, well, there's a formula there of what challenged sovereignty is. And I said that challenged sovereignty is a sigma of 3 conditions. Condition 1, condition 2, condition 3. The Commissioner of Police is wondering, well, what are these conditions the professor is talking about? When we go to the next slide, we'll see what these conditions are. I'll let you spend a minute to read some of them. I'll just mention the first one. The authorized officials of a state can no longer effectively protect the territorial integrity of their state from intruders, whether such intruders are state or non-state actors, and irrespective of whether the intruders aim to have a sustained presence in the jurisdiction in question or just transit. If you take condition 1, condition 2, condition 3 as a package, I argue that you're talking about a circumstance of challenged sovereignty. Now, if you read the chapter where I elaborate on challenged sovereignty, I am proposing that challenged sovereignty is not limited to the Caribbean. You can see challenged sovereignty in Central America. You can see challenged sovereignty in Southeast Asia. You can see challenged sovereignty in parts of the Middle East, where the small states in the Gulf cannot by themselves deal with their domestic issues. They've got to extend the perimeter of engagement beyond their own jurisdictions. So we're not talking about a phenomenon that is unique to the Caribbean. It happens that I am applying this concept and looking at the manifestations of it in the Caribbean, not limited to the Caribbean. Next slide, please. So we move now to the third question mark. What are some of the main findings? The challenges that are, for me, problems without passports are not simply challenges within the Caribbean. They are challenges of the Caribbean. Whether you're talking Anglophone Caribbean, Hispanic Caribbean, Francophone Caribbean, is just a matter of degrees of challenge. So this is not a unique to Jamaica or unique to Trinidad. It's a cross-regional reality. If you were to make the application of challenged sovereignty as a concept to Central America, the same is true. It's not simply a reality within, it's a reality of the entire region. And it's a reality to the extent where, as you may appreciate, the manifestations are not equal in all cases. One of the things that is a troubling reality, and perhaps Dale may talk a little bit about it, although we have a growing cyber threat in the Caribbean, a lot of it is unreported. Businesses don't want to talk about it. So there's an underlying iceberg there. What we're seeing are only manifestations of the tip. The problems with our passports do not manifest themselves in the same way. The problem of terrorism is not contemporaneously the same for Trinidad and Tobago now as it was 10, 15 years ago. Nevertheless, there are sufficient commonalities across the region, next slide please, as to make it something to be of a clear and present danger that we should pay attention to. But here it is in relation to these main findings. It is not only an academic like myself who deem these problems with our passports as clear and present dangers. The political leaders, the ministers of national security, the governors of the central banks, the ministers of finance, the prime ministers, also have a same conclusion. These are clear and present dangers, but it's not only the regional leaders. The leaders in places outside the Caribbean that deal with the Caribbean, that have an interest in the Caribbean, have come to the same conclusion. The drugs, the crime, the terrorism, the cyber threat are challenges beyond one nation's ability to deal with, requiring collective engagement. And we know a harsh reality of small states, whether in the Caribbean or elsewhere, is that the limitations of their capabilities is of such, even if these issues were amenable to individual country or a region engagement, their transnational character means that you've got to have collaboration with people outside your region. European Union, United States. And there's a chapter where I explain the imperatives of collaboration, the necessity for Caribbean countries. And the very necessity poses a lot of problems. Because sometimes you are intent on going in one direction, but the people who are giving you the aid that you need have something else in mind. Challenge to your sovereignty, even though you need the help, you're obligated to take a certain kind of help for a certain purpose. Next slide, please. There is no way that a book written 2020, 21, 22, 23 could ignore the reality of the implications and the impact of the pandemic. And so there's a healthy discussion of the way in which the pandemic actually worsened the challenge sovereignty. The pandemic created some conditions where the telework, the telemedicine, the distance learning that became necessary created spaces for the cyber guys to invade. The pandemic also revealed the capability limitations of countries in the Caribbean being able to deal with the pandemic. Had to rely on foreign countries, non-Caribbean countries for the vaccines. The minister will give 1,000 TT dollars. He doesn't like to give US dollars on Thursdays, only TT dollars. We'll give 1,000 TT dollars to anyone who can tell us which Caribbean country was the only country able to produce vaccines during the pandemic. The minister can't hear you. Minister, you got $1,000 to give some people. Cuba was the only Caribbean country with the technical capabilities to produce vaccines. All the other countries had to rely upon American or British or Chinese or Indian vaccines. That is a manifestation of a challenged sovereignty reality. And it was not only the vaccines that we had to rely on. The PPEs, the masks, the oxygen tanks, all the things that were necessary for the condition precipitated by the pandemic to be managed. Our sovereignty was challenged to the point where we could not by ourselves. Next slide, please. With it. I spent a good deal of time looking at each of the problems with our passports. And for the chapter on drugs, I used some of the lyrics from an anthem about marijuana reform by a gentleman called Peter Tosh. I'm sure many of you know Peter Tosh's anthem about legalize it. And you'll see in the 5th stanza, he is advocating marijuana reform, touting the benefits of marijuana. It's good for the flu. It's good for asthma. It's good for tuberculosis. Even umaracomphosis. President of the CCJ has another $1,000. Adrian, I hope you got your money ready, boy. Who can tell us what umaracomphosis is? I myself didn't know. So I had to reach out. What Peter Tosh was saying, along with other advocates of marijuana reform, is that these things that some people deem illegal have lots of benefits. One of the benefits is that marijuana helps to deal with menstrual cramps. Umaracomphosis refers to menstrual cramps. Now, I've never had to try it myself to see how it works. But I took the word of the people who know umaracomphosis. Peter Tosh and other advocates of marijuana reform would have been pleased to be alive in 2024. Next slide, please. To see the advance in the marijuana reform in the region. As a matter of fact, I spent a good deal of the chapter on drugs, explaining how someone at this very university, she was then the dean of the law school, Anne-Marie Belantoine, she was leader of a commission examining this phenomenon, and I even capture many of the recommendations, many of which thankfully have become implementable and implemented in the Caribbean. So Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and many others would have been celebrating what has been a reality that they were talking about. These drugs are not necessarily harmful. Absolutely, they've got benefits. But not only have there been reforms in relation to marijuana in the Caribbean countries, in the very United States, 48 of the American states and the District of Columbia have legalized marijuana for medicinal and recreational purposes. But therein lies part of the conundrum. Although it is legal within the states, it is not legal to travel across states or across the nation. So there are still counter-narcotics wars between the United States and other countries, while it is now legal to grow and consume certain quantities within the states. And when we go to the next slide, I explain in the book how the legalization within the United States has led to a new dynamic in the marijuana relationship between Caribbean countries and the United States. It is now increasingly being found that there's marijuana trafficking from the United States, guess where? To the Caribbean. The drugs are not only going as traditionally from Caribbean countries or from South American countries through Caribbean to North America. They're trafficking now, moving. I give the details of a case in Brooklyn where the chef, she wanted to prove to her Jamaican friends that American ganja is better than Jamaican ganja. So she decided to take some. The judge magistrate said, ma'am, you can't do that. you got to pay a fine or go to prison. So the reality of this drugs phenomenon in regards to the PWP, there are very many dynamic realities as a result of what the American political system has modified its behavior to be. And I encourage you to look at some of the details of how within the Caribbean, the reforms are beginning to take off in ways. And there's I provide the evidence from the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago. What is this meant in terms of the criminal justice system? So many young Trinidadian men in prison for 1 or 2 spiff. It costs the Trinidadian government more to keep some people in prison than the cost of the drugs that they're alleged to have trafficked or possessed. And so the reforms are beginning to take root in some places. But as I explained in the book, marijuana reform will not obviate the need to manage the state of relations with regard to drugs, because marijuana is not the only drugs battling Caribbean and United States in their relationships. There is no methamphetamines produced in the Caribbean, but it is coming through the Caribbean. There is no crack or cocaine production in the Caribbean, but they come through the Caribbean. So there still there's got to be the need for vigilance in regard to the other drugs, in addition to managing the legitimate production for medicinal and other purposes. As a matter of fact, some Caribbean countries are now exporting marijuana. St. Vincent was one of the first in the Eastern Caribbean export to Germany for research. Oh, Peter Tosh would have been so happy had he been alive to see things happening next year. So let's go to the next slide. But the reality is that it is not only the drugs that present a problem without passports, the criminality, the violence. And the pinnacle of that criminality is manifested in the homicides. Look at this portrait for the year 2021. See how all Caribbean countries, not just Jamaicans, should feel wounded by having Jamaica having more per capita crime than Venezuela. And when we go to the next slide, you'll see that when we micro-examine, next slide, please. Look at the reality that in 2023, the per capita homicides in St. Kitts and Nevis was higher than the per capita homicides in Jamaica. The Eastern Caribbean countries are now facing an onslaught. They can't cope. Their sovereignty is challenged. The reality is crime constitutes a clear and present danger. It is rushing up against sovereignty in a variety of ways. Let's go to the next slide. Maybe curious about Trinidad and Tobago. Not a very laudable portrait. Thankfully, the crime rate has begun to take a downward trend. We hope that trend continues in Trinidad and Tobago and continues in Jamaica. But I know the commissioner and the chief of defense staff are not resting on their laurels, taking pride in the fact that things went down 1 year. The Minister of National Security cannot rest in a comfort zone. Oh, we had a decline in 2023 over 2022. Because if you look at the trend and the implications of the trend over the years have been worrying. But it is not only the high homicides that worry. I spent a good deal of the book looking at some of the economic crimes in the Caribbean. You know, it's one of the troubling economic crimes in the Caribbean? Theft of electricity. Theft of electricity. There are places in the region where people take pride in not paying their bills. They don't pay cable bills, and they're proud about it. They don't pay for electricity, they're proud about it. So you've got to look at a variety of the criminality on the criminal spectrum to see where the clear and present dangers present themselves. Domestic violence is still a challenge in many Caribbean countries. And it's not only men beating women. I'm not going to ask any man here to raise his arm if his wife used to beat him up. Unless you want to volunteer to raise your hand. You know, he said, you know, you're not volunteering. Domestic violence is still a reality in our region. Next slide, please. Let me share with you one powerful observation, which is not only relevant to Jamaica, but was voiced by the Prime Minister of Jamaica. Every Jamaican would have recognized the nature and frequency of the violence have evolved, etc. It appears to be designed and properly calculated to drive fear into the citizenry of the country and panic in communities. That's the harsh reality of many Caribbean countries. The Eastern Caribbean countries now are facing that kind of harsh reality that was there for a while in Trinidad, as was there for a while in Jamaica. But it is the nexus between the homicides and the weapons. Tony Ivelaw, who is left, talked about that small arms survey report. If you get a chance to read that document, it's a sobering reflection of the reality of our region. And the weapons are coming by and large from North America. The spirit may be willing, but the flesh is weak insofar as the United States is concerned to be able to curb that trafficking in region. Although small arms have been smuggled to the Caribbean from Europe, Latin America, and Asia, most of the weapons originate in the United States. And so by virtue of what has been the experience, the link between the criminality and what is being used to perpetrate the criminality, the weapons, many jurisdictions, particularly Jamaica, has been having to declare states of emergency, almost becoming an El Salvador, with the frequency and the regularity of states of emergency as a way of coping. Next slide, please, with the realities of the climate. But, ladies and gentlemen, I want to recommend that there are some downsides beyond the criminality. This regard is clear and present danger that has to do with crime and drugs and other things. There's a distinguished Russian writer called Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is credited with having said the following: the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. The harsh reality is that Caribbean prisons are a poor reflection of the vaunted civilization that we hold ourselves to be. Not only by what this chart reflects the overcrowded nature of the prisons, but think of a prison where not only the facilities are derelict and dilapidated, some of them 100, 200 years old, some of them built for X number of prisoners. I'll give you an example. When I was writing that book, Drugs and Security in the Caribbean, I did some things that drove my wife crazy. I decided to do a lot of field work. I spent a couple of nights again aboard a U.S. Coast Guard cutter doing interdiction. Almost drive her crazy. I visited the Port of Spain prison, Frederick Street. I had intended, Minister, to spend a day. I couldn't go past like 2 hours. That prison was built, you know when, Commissioner? The year 1812. It was built when there was a war between Britain and the United States to house prisoners from the United States. It was built for 250 prisoners. The day I visited, there were over 800 people. Think of what it means to have such a severely overcrowded prison. Not only for the prisoners, but for the people who manage the prison. And that was one of the refrains I heard Cipriani Batiste, was the prison commissioner at the time. It does something to you to have to be managing people from your society, not having the facilities, not having the ability to do rehabilitation, and enabling a recycling of prison criminality. They come out, they go back into the crime because sometimes that's all they know, all they can do. So I argue in the book, and I want to recommend to you that there is a dimension of this reality having to do with the prisons that we minded to address before the civilization implodes generally. Think of what it means for 20–25% of your nation's productive citizens. Most of the prisons in our region are significantly populated by the younger people between 18 and 35. Those are the most productive ages for any society. And when you're incarcerating so many of your productive folk, what does it mean to the society's economic and social viability over long term? What does it mean to the values inculcated in that society? Next slide, please. So I argue that this business of the prisons, red lights are being provided by the prisons about our civilization. We've got to do something better. I chaired a conference last year in St. Kitts on prison reform, and it was saddening to hear the reports of the prisons commissioners. They've got to cope with the realities of budget limitations. I was pleased to learn that, for example, in Belize, the prisons there were funded by the Rotarians, who largely take the burden off the government in running the prison. This is a reality we cannot ignore. We know about the reality of the terrorism realities in Trinidad and Tobago, which was at one point the kind of the centerpiece of terrorism engagement. But I think we often are not minded to see terrorism before 9/11 as something troubling the Caribbean. You might remember what was called the Guyana disaster, the destruction of a plane off Barbados that killed 73 Guyanese, Cubans, North Koreans. That was terrorism before 9/11. And so I think you might find it useful, the next slide, please, in the conversation about terrorism, to see what is it in the narrative definition of terrorism the region was encouraged not to pay much attention to until 9/11. It's a healthy discussion there. Let's go to the next slide because we want to come to the end. Please do not underestimate the significant growing threat of cyber. I said to a journalist from Barbados 2 weeks ago, we're talking about Cricket World Cup. The security forces in Barbados and other jurisdictions have got to be concerned with cyber now that Cricket World Cup is in its planning. People are going to be looking to see how they can hold businesses to ransom, how the document falsification is going to be manifesting itself. People are going to be using the Cricket World Cup jurisdictions not to come to it, but to come through it, to go elsewhere. Clear and present danger. We'll talk a little bit more from Dale later on. Let's go to the next slide as we end. And I thought it's a sobering reality sometimes to see the graphic evidence of a projected cost to cyber. In the book, chapter 6, I have the cases in Jamaica and Trinidad and Guyana, in St. Vincent, where the cyber realities are clear and present. And all of that in the context of still underreporting cyber. Let's go to the next slide. We're almost to the end. If you ask the question, what Caribbean jurisdiction is alleged to have the most dramatic manifestation of cybercrime? It's Puerto Rico. But Dominican Republic and the United States conducted a joint operation 2 years ago, clear and present manifestations of how the pandemic provided an umbrella under which the cyber criminals were conducting their fleecing of people from the United States and Dominican Republic. Next slide, please. And so I come to the conclusion in regard to the two questions asked: how secure is security? I say not very. How sovereign is sovereignty? I said sovereignty was really never sovereign. For a variety of reasons, we had a certain notion of sovereignty coming out of the Westphalia Treaty. But over time, the globalization realities, the problems with our passports, have made that notion of the Westphalian characterization of sovereignty a falsity. You may not agree with my conclusion, but I pride myself on providing the evidence that would lead to that conclusion. And so for me, sovereignty was really, never was sovereign. And now the sovereignty ship is churning in Category 4 hurricane seas. The sovereignty is even under greater siege. So let's end by looking with some words of wisdom that are captured in the epigraph of chapter 8, the final chapter of the book. I went back to something that Jose Marti said in 1891. Jose Marti, the distinguished writer, nationalist of Cuba. We can no longer be a nation, we can use region, of fluttering leaves, spending our lives in the air, or treetop crowned in flowers, humming or creaking by the caprices of sunlight, or thrashed and felled by tempests. Jose Marti said, "It is the hour of reckoning and of marching in unison, and we must move in lines as compact as the veins of the silver that lie at the roots of the Andes." We have got an obligation to march in unison as a region to deal with this challenge to our collective sovereignty. But I also leave you with some words of wisdom from, next slide, please, Sridhar Ramphal. You know, the Commonwealth had convened a group in the 80s to look at small state security. The first meeting of that group, Sridhar Ramphal, who was then Secretary General, made a statement, and I thought it'd be useful as some words of wisdom to end with this. Sometimes it seems as if small states were like small boats pushed out into a turbulent sea, free in one sense to traverse it, but without oars or provisions, without compass or sails, free also to perish, or perhaps to be rescued and taken aboard a larger vessel. I leave you with those words of wisdom. Shall we be taken aboard by a larger vessel, or shall we find a way to persist and to persist and to persist? Thank you.
Esteemed guests, one of the opportunities that I had when I read Professor Griffith's work is the convergence between two challenging issues, one being decolonization and the other being globalization, and the extent to which both of these challenges have presented the current state of challenged sovereignty in the region based on the convergence between traditional threats and new and emerging threats. This is important work, ladies and gentlemen, and it sets the stage for a significant amount of consideration as it pertains to how we apply this important work by Professor Griffith as we grapple through governance in the region, not just for us, but certainly for also the generations to come. Ladies and gentlemen, I am significantly inspired by this work, and I trust that you are as well. So as we move forward, let's certainly give Professor Griffith a hearty round of applause. So moving on with our commentaries, I take this time to introduce Professor Andy Knight, Provost Fellow of the Black Excellence and Leadership at the University of Alberta. He's a distinguished professor and former chair of political science. Professor Knight has served as director of the Institute of International Relations at U.W.I, Trinidad and Tobago, and a co-founder of the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean. A fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, Knight is recognized among Alberta's top 50 influential figures. He holds the Harry Jerome Trailblazer Award and the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Medal. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Andy Knight, who will give his commentary on the work of Professor Griffith.
Thank you very much for having me today to speak about Ivelaw Griffith's book on challenged sovereignty. This is really a masterpiece of description and critical analysis by one of the Caribbean's renowned security scholars, Professor Ivelaw Griffith. And it demonstrates the difficulty of governing in our complex, interdependent, and interconnected and multicentric world. Griffith's excellent take on challenged sovereignty is a tour de force of the impact of the problems without passports, as he calls it, PWPs, that skillfully blends his vast empirical knowledge of the concatenated nature of security phenomena, drugs, crimes, terrorism, cybersecurity, with an evolving conceptual understanding of how small, subordinate, and subaltern states, like those in the Caribbean, are negatively impacted by the existential threats that are the result of globalization. This book owes its intellectual tradition to Eric Williams, former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. His book on capitalism and slavery that was published in 1944. And it also owes its conceptual origins to Kofi Annan's notion of problems without passports. It reminds us that in our increasingly intermestic world, in which boundary lines are separating, that normally separates the local from the global, have now become increasingly blurred. Sovereignty is no longer sacrosanct, if ever it was. Instead of doing an analysis of the book's take on drugs, crimes, terrorism, and cybersecurity, I want to treat those four major insecurity issues as a critical security package, and then reflect on the notion of challenged sovereignty as a conceptual innovation. We should also note that significant attention is paid in the book on Suriname, something that's normally not given enough treatment in many of the regions and serious security analyses. So I want to sort of at least flag that as a major contribution to the literature. Now, how are drugs, crime, terrorism, and cybersecurity treated as a critical security package in Professor Ivelaw Griffith's book? Now, we know that in the Caribbean, these intersecting cross-border problems without passports have shaken the very foundation of nation states in the region. And Professor Ivelaw blends case studies with regional analysis, and he examines the region-wide impact of PWPs and the complex security and sovereignty issues that are at play. The interaction of local and global forces within PWPs undermines the governments of the region basic goal of protecting their people against military threats, against subversion, and against the erosion of political, economic, and social values. In other words, They pose a challenge to the Westphalian notion of sovereignty. And this is particularly acute during what I call the interregnum. For anyone who's read recently my work on the interregnum, basically the argument I'm trying to make here is that we're living through a period of instability, transformation, flux, uncertainty. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that we have shifted from an old world order that was created in 1945 to a different kind of world order that's in the process of being created. So while we don't know what that world order is going to look like yet, we do know that we are going through major challenges to the pillars that held up the world order of the past. The interconnected issues of drugs, crimes, terrorism, and cybersecurity is treated by the author Ivelaw Griffith as a critical concatenated security package because of the interrelated impact of these security challenges on regional stability, on governance, and on development. So let me focus on how Professor Griffith treats each of these components of the security package in his book, Challenge Sovereignty. Let's first take a look at the drugs situation. We know from some of Professor Griffith's earlier work that the Caribbean region is a major transit point for drug trafficking between South America, particularly Colombia, and North America. Drug trafficking fuels organized crime, violence, and corruption within Caribbean societies. The impact that drugs have in the region extends beyond criminal activity and impacts public health, for example, with increased cases of addiction and substance abuse. And to address these drug-related issues, therefore, we must think very seriously about how regional and international cooperation, law enforcement efforts, and public health interventions need to be coordinated. And then let's take a look at his take on crime. Prevalent in much of the Caribbean region are high rates of crime, including violent crime, petty crime as well. But crime undermines social cohesion, it undermines economic development, and the overall quality of life for residents of this region. The link between crime and drug trafficking is significant, as Professor Griffith pointed out in his book. Criminal organizations engage in various illicit activities such as drug smuggling, human trafficking, money laundering, and arms trafficking. So crime is therefore a multifaceted issue that requires comprehensive strategies that involve law enforcement, community engagement, and socio-economic development. And let's look at terrorism and Professor Griffith's take on terrorism. Now, while terrorism is not prevalent in the Caribbean compared to other regions of the world, the potential for terrorist activities exists due to the region's proximity to the United States, which has become like a target for many of the terrorist activities these days, and its status as a major tourist destination, the Caribbean is. Now, concerns related to terrorism include the possibility of extremist groups exploiting weak governance, porous borders, and transnational criminal networks for their activity. Caribbean countries often collaborate with international partners to enhance counterterrorism capabilities and to strengthen border security. I should mention, although this is not necessarily a major point being dealt with in the book, that Trinidad and Tobago, where this book launch is being held, was actually the focus of a lot of attention when a large number of individuals from Trinidad and Tobago actually went to Syria to fight on behalf of ISIS. In other words, ISIS as a terrorist organization was able to recruit from the Caribbean. So this is not a far-fetched issue for us. And I think Ivelaw Griffith is very much aware of that fact. And finally, let's take a look at cybersecurity, because this is one of the increasing challenges for security in the Caribbean region. And with the increasing digitization of societies, cybersecurity has emerged as a critical aspect of national and regional security. The Caribbean faces cybersecurity challenges such as data breaches, cyber crimes, threats to critical infrastructure, etc. Weak cybersecurity measures can have serious implications for financial systems, for government operations, and for personal privacy. Building cybersecurity capacity and fostering international cooperation are essential to address these threats effectively. So Ivelaw Griffith's significant contribution in this book, this new book of his, is to alert students and observers of Caribbean security to the importance of treating drugs, crimes, terrorism, and cybersecurity as a collective security package. He underscores in this text the interconnected nature of the issues involved and the need for Caribbean leaders and policymakers, therefore, to develop integrated policy responses to these problems. Effective governance, regional cooperation, and international partnerships are therefore seen as crucial for tackling these complex security challenges, according to Professor Griffith, and the concatenated violence that ensues, and for promoting stability and development in the Caribbean region. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me on this topic. And I really want to promote this book, Challenge Sovereignty, to all of my students and colleagues in North America. I think they get a very, very good sense of the challenges faced by Caribbean states and the Caribbean community today. Thank you very much.
Next up is Professor Wendy Grenard. Professor Grenard holds a PhD in International Studies from the University of Miami. She's a professor at School of Arts and Sciences, St. George's University in Grenada. Prior to joining the SGU, Dr. Grenard was employed at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus, as a lecturer and then senior lecturer in political science. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Wendy Grenard.
Good evening, and I wish to thank the organizers for inviting me to this most important event as we celebrate this new work. I really wish I could have been there, but circumstances do not allow. Congratulations to Professor Ivelaw Griffith for yet another scholarly masterpiece. Now, over the years, Professor Griffith really provided an intellectual reservoir containing rich scholarship from which many of us have drawn. The very title of this latest work captures the contemporary reality very well. Challenged Sovereignty, the impact of drugs, crime, terrorism, and cyber threats in the Caribbean. Now, in this work, Griffith critically brings together in one place old and new problems without passports. And he does so in a new time. And I must say that this book really resonates with me because of my own interests in the multidimensionality and transnationality of security threats. And of course, the implications for states for the people within them, and for regions such as our own Caribbean community. The book makes a significant contribution to the discourse on security, sovereignty, and the state in the context of globalization. Now, I must say it has a strong social rationale. If we ask who cares, we should all care, because these problems without passports are really clear and present dangers, and they affect all of us. Just think about crime and mothers and young men, and let's think about cyber threats and what these mean for us in our lived realities. So there is a strong social rationale. There is also a very strong and well-justified intellectual rationale. Why would you write a book like this? And why would you do so in this time? Now, while Griffith himself and other scholars have labored in the vineyard for decades, making sense of the Caribbean's security landscape, this latest work fills a glaring gap in the literature. In fact, as Griffith himself observes, it is the first single-authored study to examine the foremost troubling problems without passports in the Caribbean and their implications for security and sovereignty. Now, in my view, a major contribution is the combination of theoretical lenses and empirical cases to interrogate the multifaceted problem. Griffith provides conceptual clarity in the first chapters. He probes these problems without passports in chapter 1, and it explores the problematic of security and sovereignty in the context of globalization. He argues that the manifestation of drugs, crime, terrorism, and cyber threats these undermine, in fact, the authority of Caribbean states, presenting a circumstance of what he calls challenged sovereignty in the process. Now, Griffith is very careful to point out that those 4 problems are not the only threats, and in fact, he threw light on the COVID-19 pandemic and what it meant for health security in the Caribbean. So Griffith locates states in a complex world with what he refers to as common features and cross-continental connections. He theorizes key concepts, the local-global nexus, interdependence, and the transnationalism. Central to his argument is the concept of vulnerability and the multifaceted dimensions of vulnerability. As part of his conceptual framework, Griffith goes beyond the narrow conceptualization, such as realism, and he expands the notion of security to include non-conventional and non-military threats. And we know that he has done that before. But what is new is the way he brings together these problems without passports and includes new issues such as cyber threats. In fact, he advances a very nuanced notion of security that is quite multidimensional. And in keeping with the title of the book, Griffith argues that challenged sovereignty is a condition where the state's vulnerability is exacerbated by both internal and external developments that compromise the ability of the supreme authority of the state to promulgate and execute domestic and foreign policy in its own deliberate judgment and on its own terms. Now, he poses 2 critical questions for readers to ponder. How secure is security? Griffith argues, not very. How sovereign is sovereignty? For Griffith, it never really was. And this is obvious now that the sovereignty ship is churning in category 4 hurricane seas. This is a must read because it really speaks to our contemporary reality in a very direct way. Griffith rhetorically asked, what is the purpose of a nation state if it cannot guarantee its citizens and visitors their security and personal safety? This is a question that we must ponder. So what then do we do? What is to be done? He advances the need for collaboration and partnerships as imperatives for states in the context of the multidimensionality and transnationality of security threats. For Griffith, regionalism also is a large vessel to navigate the multiple and interconnected manifestations of insecurities. And I really like how he pulled together the manifestations of security threats. Griffith ends this most timely and relevant work with a poem of defiance and hope, penned by Jamaican-born Claude McKay. The poem is titled, If We Must Die. And I'll read a little part of it. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, haunted and penned in an inglorious spot. Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Dying, but fighting back. For every Caribbean boy and girl, dying, but fighting back. For every mother who has lost a son or a daughter to drugs, dying, but fighting back. I really liked how he ended the book on this note because it becomes personal for many of us. And it does not only have scholarly, but also policy relevance. That's a strength of the book. So congratulations to Professor Ivelaw Griffith. I'm really sorry I can't be with you all this evening, but congratulations for the sophistication with which you have weaved together the tapestry of the Caribbean's security landscape in the 21st century. And I wish you all the best for a very, very successful evening.
Professor Griffith, you made a public inquiry of the arrival of one of the attendees for this evening. So I want to take the opportunity to recognize Ambassador Anthony Philip Spencer, who just arrived, and just to ask him to come forward, please. Next up on the agenda of commentaries is Dr. Georgina Shami. Dr. Shami is a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, more specifically the Institute of International Relations, and her areas of expertise are peace and security, migration, peace building, and diplomacy. She was the recipient of the Central America Caribbean Fulbright Visiting Scholars Program in 2010. And I might add my own PhD supervisor. In this regard, may we have Dr. Georgina Shami's presentation.
Good day, Chair, esteemed panelists, Professor Griffith, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first to express my sincere appreciation to Professor Griffith for the invitation to present comments on his sterling contribution to Caribbean security, titled Challenge Sovereignty. Central to Professor Griffith's exploration is the notion of problems without passports, which refers to the transnational issues of drugs, crime, terrorism, and cyber threats. Through a skillful combination of case studies and regional analyses, Professor Griffith navigates the complex impact of these issues on the Caribbean region, particularly showing how they undermine the fundamental goals of governments in preserving and protecting their territorial integrity, security, and sovereignty. Addressing these complex challenges necessitates tackling both conventional and unconventional security and sovereignty concerns. Professor Griffith examines instances of conflict between these estates and state authorities, with specific reference to events in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and the escalating cyber threats throughout the region. These case studies have been carefully chosen because they reflect the changing structure of sovereignty, which is the major thrust of this book. What has become quite clear is that the state is no longer the sole actor in international relations and the primary focus of security concerns. Contemporary security dynamics revolve around the tensions between traditional security paradigms and emerging security challenges. This reflects the evolving and multifaceted nature of present-day security. Within the Caribbean, issues like drugs and crime are now more salient than the traditional concerns. Professor Griffith contends that drugs and crime undermine the security and sovereignty in the Caribbean. In order to illustrate the latter, he examines two country-specific cases, the 2019 Dudus affair in Jamaica and the state of emergency in Trinidad and Tobago in 2011. This forms the discussion in Chapter 6, which I am asked to review. The Dudus affair. The Dudus affair has both domestic and international dimensions. Central to this case study is Mr. Christopher Dudus Cook, the Don, gang leader, and criminal entrepreneur of a gang called the Shower Posse. The case highlighted the challenge of state sovereignty, particularly evident in Cook's establishment of a zone or garrison in Kingston beyond state authority and control, known as Tivoli Gardens. In August 2009, a request for the extradition of Mr. Cook was made to face drug charges in the United States. There was unrest following Cook's indictment in New York. The resistance of residents in Tivoli Gardens to the apprehension of Mr. Cook influenced the subsequent events, culminating in the extensive use of force by the Jamaican state. The Dudus affair was a manifestation of the compromising of Jamaica's internal sovereignty. It brought to the forefront various issues concerning the securitization of drug trafficking in Jamaica, as well as who truly serves as the securitizing agents in Jamaica. It makes one question, is it those who with legitimate authority or those who are commanding and controlling vast drug empires and wielding significant influence over entire communities? This affects the notion of sovereignty in its traditional form and understanding. Jamaican drug kingpins like Mr. Dudus do not hold legitimate authority within the state, yet they command such authority that entire communities comply with their directives in ways that even legitimate political leaders struggle to achieve from those same communities. This shows the limitation of state authority and the influence of criminal gangs in marginalized communities. The chapter underscores the fact that structural economic inequalities drives complicity with criminal activity in deprived communities, posing a great concern for regional stability and sovereignty. Another interesting feature pointed out by Professor Griffith in the Dudus affair was the role of the Jamaican Labour Party. This party was heavily involved in efforts to thwart the extradition of Christopher Dudus Cook. Moreover, it is doubtful that Christopher Dudus Cook could have developed such a formidable power base without the support of the party, and worse still, that of the government. As respected Jamaican political scientist Rupert Lewis says, the Don controls the use of violence and scarce benefits and keeps the constituency aligned to the party with a huge polarity of votes, so the member of parliament is guaranteed a safe seat. The Dudus affair showed only a limited exercise of sovereignty by the Jamaican state over the entire national, territorial, and political space. This was also evident in other parts of Jamaica where garrisons existed. Indeed, the extradition and eradication of Jamaica's drug trafficking problem is deemed implausible due to its multifaceted nature. Griffith refers to this as the drug dilemma, characterized by its multidimensional aspects. Unfortunately, the Dudus affair is a prime example of how drugs and crime undermine the sovereignty and security of a state. The other case highlighted in Chapter 6 is the 2011 state of emergency in Trinidad and Tobago. The state of emergency in 2011 demonstrated important insight on the subjects of sovereignty and security within the TNT context. On May 24, 2010, the People's Partnership government took office. After chairing her first National Security Council meeting, the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Kamla Persad-Bissessar, declared the government's commitment to fulfill its promise to the people of Trinidad and Tobago to combat crime. Approximately 15 months later, despite the People's Partnership government's claims of success in reducing homicide rates, there was an unexpected declaration of a state of emergency on August 21, 2011. The declaration cited a threat to national security, and no specific reasons was given or disclosed for the state of emergency. Consequently, questions arose as to why the People's Partnership government did not communicate of the impending danger to the national community. In seeking to justify the proclamation of the state of emergency, the then government argued that there was an increase in the level of crime prior to the SOE and the widespread use of firearms in the commission of those crimes. The then president also articulated that credible national security intelligence was received about the escalation in violent crime linked to the then recent counter-narcotics activities. As a result, it was felt that there was a genuine danger of gangs seeking revenge and retaliation, which posed a serious threat to public safety as well as law and order. Consequently, the then president was satisfied that the nature and extent of these events endangered public safety to an extent that warranted the declaration of a state of emergency. But more significantly, it also highlights the dangerous and debilitating nexus between drugs and crime and how it threatens security and sovereignty of a state. It is not known that the manufacture of firearms is not carried out in Trinidad and Tobago. Therefore, they must be imported, albeit illegally. The logical conclusion is that the gangs have established links with bad actors abroad and successfully avoid detention by agents of the state. Herein lies the external dimension to the operation preceding the state of emergency. A curfew also formed part of the SOE. The principal focus on what came to be known as hotspots. For several months, there ensued a robust and healthy debate regarding the effectiveness of these measures in protecting the citizens and safeguarding the nation. Crime rates undeniably decreased during the emergency period when the police and army worked jointly and had unprecedented powers to search and arrest suspects without the usual requirement of probable cause. The statistics from this time period are impressive. Hundreds of individuals were arrested, numerous firearms and thousands of rounds of ammunition were seized, along with significant quantities of illegal drugs with hundreds of millions of dollars. While these achievements are commendable, they cannot be maintained solely through the implementation of a state of emergency. Furthermore, it's worth noting that despite the arrest of 242 individuals under the anti-gang legislation, all had to be released, and some even received substantial compensation from the state for wrongful arrests. The most serious human rights issues included police killings during apprehension or custody, as well as mistreatment of suspect detainees and prisoners. While the government took measures to prosecute security force members and other officials implicated in killings or misconduct, there remained a perception of impunity due to the protracted nature of many investigations and the sluggish progress of criminal judicial proceedings overall. Furthermore, representatives of the Afro-Trinidadian community have expressed deep concern over the sight of young Black men being handcuffed by police, a visual reminder of the historical injustices perpetrated by a colonial regime. Criticism was leveled against the government of racial profiling, but the government denied any wrongdoing. There is little interest in the charges and countercharges because the fundamental problem is the threat to sovereignty and the widespread fear on the part of the population which comes in its wake. In viewing the continuing crime escalation, one is inclined to ask, what is the fate of the sovereignty of small states such as Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago? It is difficult to answer this question with mathematical precision, but it is reasonable to speculate that the traditional threats to territorial integrity and other destabilizing activities on the part of more powerful states would not disappear. Even more worrisome are the clandestine operations of bad actors across national frontiers, whom small states are hard-pressed to ward off. Questions still remain. How secure is security? And how sovereign is sovereignty? But please do not despair. All is not lost. From Professor Griffith's comprehensive analysis, Caribbean nations must now strive to address the myriad challenges to their security. The magnitude of the task often exceeds the capacity of small state actors. He suggests that Caribbean countries must adopt a more unified approach in confronting these issues identified as problems without passports, and collaborate closely with allied nations such as the US, Europe, United Kingdom, and Canada. It is therefore submitted that multilateral diplomacy must be the most effective response to problems such as arms and drug smuggling, crime, and attacks from cyberspace. Challenge sovereignty offers an abundance of valuable information. Professor Griffith's expertise shines through, demonstrating his mastery of Caribbean affairs, international security, and international relations. In conclusion, may I once again thank Professor Griffith for this opportunity. Have a great evening and enjoy your stay with us in Trinidad. God bless and thank you.
If I take my cue from the three commentaries on the book so far, I do not envy those who are coming after. But in this regard, I also want to suggest that we are moving swiftly along, mindful that we did have a late start and that the evening is expiring quite quickly. So let's introduce the cultural item at this time. And in this regard, I would like to invite the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service, who will entertain us with a cultural event. Excellent rendition by the representative from the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service. Let's give him another round of applause. So we are on the way. And at this time, we would like to invite the three commentaries who would be here, who would be delivering their commentaries in person. We would want to invite them to come and have a seat at the podium, but before that, may I ask Professor Griffith to join us at the podium? So, Prof, you're asked to take the center seat. All is red, so I can't say it's the hot seat. I also want to ask Ms. Dawn Spicer to join us, please. Ms. Dawn Spicer is the Executive Director of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. Ms. Spicer is an attorney by profession with over 30 years experience in the area of anti-money laundering, countering terrorism financing and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. She has participated in all 4 rounds of the CPATIF's Mutual Evaluation Program, a very experienced practitioner. I want to also invite at this time Dr. Wendell Wallace. I'm not seeing him. He might have stepped out. Dr. Wallace is an attorney at law, certified mediator, and senior lecturer in criminology and criminal justice at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. His research focuses on policing, violence, and gangs. He's the author and editor of 9 books, 45 journal articles, and has received 2 international awards for his research. Presently, he's curating the Palgrave Handbook on Criminology. Dr. Wallace, could you kindly join us? So there's a vacant seat. And I want to step out on a limb here. And given Professor Griffith's disclosure to us of who was the person that was present with him at the foundation of the idea behind this book, I want to ask Ambassador Philip Spencer to kindly join the seating arrangement for this important disclosure. My apologies. I also want to include the Dr. Dale Joseph, prophetically, Chief Analyst Cyber at CARICOM Impacts, and provides strategic support for cybercrime investigations, cybersecurity, and cyber defense activities. With over 25 years of law enforcement experience, he holds a bachelor's degree in computer science and a master's in forensic computing and cybercrime investigations. He's also a certified digital forensics trainer and has conducted workshops for law enforcement, private sector, and government entities with the digitization of the public sector and its implications for cybersecurity and more specifically cyber attacks. I take this opportunity to invite Mr. Spicer, soon to be Doctor. May I also take the opportunity to invite Ambassador Philip Spencer to join on the behest of Professor Griffith. Ambassador Philip Spencer.
How's your name on it, Tony?
Getting used to these type of invitations.
Okay, so we do have 3 microphones. So there will be a bit of sharing of sovereignty of the use of the mics. And so first up, I would like to ask Ms. Spicer to give your commentary on the book as directed or asked by Professor Griffith. Ms. Spicer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to start by saying all protocols being previously established. Good evening. I thought I was not going to be in deep waters until, of course, Major Lynch indicated that hard act to follow. So now I feel the pressure. So congratulations, Dr. Griffith. This is just awesome. Over the many years that I've known you professionally, you have always produced works of art that help persons in this field to progress, to understand clearly what the issues are, and to apply what you have produced in your books to good use. And this latest book that you've done is absolutely no exception. I am going to provide a few comments on chapter 5, which deals with the trauma of terror and cyber threats. And terrorism is indeed a traumatic experience for the targeted victims and others who become collateral damage. It's a wanton expression of rage, of entitlement, of religious fervor, where those terrorists really don't care who they hurt and the damage that they've done and the cost of that damage, not only in terms of human life, but as I explained in that chapter, the economic costs to countries. So as noted by Dr. Griffith, there's both a geopolitical and geoeconomic impact of terrorism. I find the insights that were provided are a good and vivid representation that will or should foster an ever greater focus on protecting the Caribbean, Latin America, and Central America region from terrorism, which can occur through physical attacks, of which there have been several in our region, in our history. As we can see in that chapter, the table lists several attacks, and through the use of the region's financial system. Now, from the CFATF's perspective as a regulator, you would say, where we monitor our members, our 24 members' compliance with the international standards that deal with terrorism and terrorism financing, it is sometimes difficult to get our members, our governments in the region to keep their foot on the gas of these types of crimes. Money laundering, terrorist financing seem all far off and distant when you have other crimes that are more prevalent. However, it should be clear to all that once there is crime, there is money laundering. Also clear, as made in the chapter, that you don't need only illicit assets to indulge in terrorist financing. You can take your legal cash, what you earn every month, and decide to give it to a non-profit organization or other entity, and they can misuse those funds either with your knowledge or without your knowledge. So I have the view that it's critical components of jurisdictions, anti-money laundering and counterterrorism. It's one of the 3 pillars of things that we look at in terms of determining the AML, CFT, CPF structure of a jurisdiction. And that AML is anti-money laundering, countering terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. And we look at it in terms of the international standards as set by the FATF. I can say that for many jurisdictions, while there are laws that criminalize money laundering, terrorist financing, there is an issue in terms of the implementation of those laws. So issues with the list sent out by the UN Security Council, and issue with countries having the ability to properly list their own terrorists, or where another country requests that a terrorist be listed, that they are able to do so. Trinidad and Tobago has done this for unfortunate reasons, simply because they have had persons who have been deemed terrorists by the UN Security Council 1267 list and also on the 1373 list. They have been asked by other jurisdictions, I believe in one instance, to also put someone on that list. So it's a use of the law, but it's something, again, that we hope we don't see a lot of. So while the CFATF in its assessments of compliance with international standards against terrorism focuses on the risk and mitigation of risk for money laundering and terrorist financing, I found in chapter 5 of Dr. Griffith's discussion on the impact of terrorism on relatable sectors such as tourism, our strategic materials. He mentioned a few. I'm just going to mention the bauxite, gold, silver, nickel, and our strategic waterways and other installations gave a vivid sense of the critical impact this area of crime can have on our region. And so I deal in recommendations. I deal in telling countries, you need to do this because this is what a recommendation says. I thought the argument he made in this chapter extremely impactful because I think it brings it down to a level where anyone, certainly governments, persons in law enforcement can understand this can decimate you, not because a bomb has gone off, but because it now impacts your country's ability to economically survive. As his point of his book is, it impacts your sovereignty. It also shows that while work has been done through the initiatives of CARICOM immediately after the 9/11 events, the work of CARICOM impacts RSS, ARU, and others, and individual governments since the 9/11, that there is more that needs to be done. If you look at the results that we see in terms of the level of compliance and the level of implementation, there is a lot of work to do in this area. And of course, part of it is the fallacy that we don't have terrorist events happening, but it does not mean the financial system is not being used for terrorism. And that is even more significant, especially where you're responsible or your financial system is responsible for transferring funds that leads to an event in another part of the world. Regarding cybersecurity, I'll briefly say it's evident that this is an essential aspect of our lives and even our livelihood. Again, the CFTS perspective is to ensure that financial transactions occurring in cyberspace are not only secure, but transparent, so that criminal actors who can now move not only fiat, but cryptocurrency at the press of a button are identified. The chapter notes the impact of COVID-19, which was significant. All the law enforcement authorities that reported to us during that period, there were increased instances of fraud, cyber fraud, romance schemes, and other elements like that. We have come out of the pandemic, thankfully, but the misuse of the cyberspace continues and is increasing. And this is something that the FATF has recognized in terms of recommendation 15, new technologies. It is something that they're trying to grasp, and it is something that is difficult for our members in this region. How do they deal with virtual assets? How do they deal with the transfer of funds? And countries are having real challenges in terms of implementing this. So there's now a public list by the Virtual Asset Contact Group that gives a global view of where countries are in terms of dealing with virtual assets. But again, as noted in the chapter, this is something where you have to have cybersecurity. It's mandatory. So these are my comments on chapter 5. And once again, thank you, Dr. Griffith. It's been an excellent read.
Okay. But next up is Dr. Wendell Wallace. May I ask him to give his comments at this time?
Good evening and thank you, Chair. I must first admit that when I saw the book that Professor Griffith sent to me, I said I experienced different or range of emotion, excitement, happiness, but also a bit of trepidation. And I am very familiar with the book. In fact, apart from being here this afternoon, I have almost completed authoring a review of the book. And in authoring that review, I said to myself, how are you going to conduct this review without pausing parts with Professor? And as I started reading and getting more into the book, I realized that this was the work of a world-renowned scholar. So what I will be doing is that I will share snippets of the book review with after. Now, attempting to fit 2 chapters or conduct a commentary on 2 chapters that has taken Professor Griffith approximately 12 years, it's a really daunting task. I'm trying to put as much as possible. Now, one of the individuals that I follow is Prof. Franklin D. Roosevelt, former president of the United States of America. And he said, when you are invited to speak, there are 3 tenets, 3 protocols that you must follow. You must be honest, you must be brief, and you must be seated. However, seeing that I'm already seated, I'll follow the other 2 protocols. I'll be honest, I'll be brief. So Knight, 1990, argues that for a period in the history of the Caribbean, the region was viewed as the epicenter of Western imperialist expansion. However, Lewis, 2013, submits that this position has changed as the Caribbean is now increasingly situated at the margins of the economy, lacking in its previous imperialist expansion. Now, as a result of that, many of the problems that we face in the Caribbean are either underreported and or unstudied. The very fact that Professor Griffith has authored this and has come to the Caribbean, come to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the book, to me, it's a testament and a testimony of the fact that we have so much talent reposed in us in the Caribbean. So I'll take you to chapter 3. In chapter 3, Professor Griffith highlights how drugs and the drug trade impacts the sovereignty of many Caribbean islands. Importantly, he speaks about problems without passports. And while we as citizens of the Caribbean, while we need passports to traverse the region, fortunately or otherwise, the movement of drugs does not need any such passport. So that's why you have the moniker problems without passport. And in fact, it presents a host of challenges to individuals and to jurisdictions in the Caribbean. Now, earlier, Professor Griffith spoke about marijuana, and he used what the Peter Tosh about legalizing it, one of my favorite songs. Now, marijuana has had a very long history in the Caribbean. And marijuana is accepted based on the fact that from a cultural and religious perspective, marijuana has a natural medicinal value. Now, while Professor Griffith does not debate those medicinal values, he points to the fact that the issue of drugs in the region is multifaceted. He uses available data as well as literature to show that marijuana is not the only problem or the only issue, I shouldn't say problem, but the only issue that we face in the Caribbean. We now have other drugs that are being consumed and trafficked in the region. We have ecstasy, we have meth, and we also have fentanyl, right, which is possibly one of the most dangerous drugs we can find globally. And you are finding these drugs popping up in Guyana, Jamaica, right here in Trinidad and Tobago, Puerto Rico, and Cayman Islands. In chapter 2, Professor Griffith also highlights the fact as to what makes the Caribbean the ideal location, the ideal venue for traffic. He points out that due to the physical and social geographics of the region, it makes it very much conducive to drug trafficking. And in chapter 2, he also points out that there are 3 key factors that are facilitators of this drug trafficking. First is the proximity of the Caribbean islands to South and North America. The second is the commercial communication and other linkages between Europe and the Caribbean. And that also facilitates that ease of movement. The third factor is that many Caribbean islands, or some Caribbean islands, are still dependencies on larger countries in the global north. And because of these linkages, you find that, according to Professor Griffith, you have some traffickers they use their contacts and their connections to traffic drugs. Another very interesting commentary by Professor Griffith is that there are two important factors that we often overlook: conflict and cooperation. And that cooperation is often facilitated by the superpowers, generally the United States. And it is instructive to note that not all interactions involve military force or might, in that some of these superpowers, they will use economic sanctions and other pressures to manage countries that they are seen as not being proactive enough in dealing with the drug trafficking issue. Professor Griffith closes chapter 2 by examining marijuana reforms and the legalization efforts of various Caribbean jurisdictions. I've also looked at chapter 4, which is titled The Crucible of Crime. And this chapter covers a wide range of issues related to crime in the Caribbean. Indeed, from my vantage point as a criminologist, there is no doubt that crime in the region, crime in the Caribbean, it's not a new phenomenon. It has been with us for a very long while, but for some people, it appears to be a recurring problem. To this end, in April 2023, Caribbean governments met right here in Port of Spain to deliberate on the pervasive issue and to seek recommendations and interventions from a disparate body of stakeholders. Professor Griffith also highlights several striking features of crime in the region. I will not touch on the homicide rate, but for me, that was really instructive when you look at smaller Caribbean countries such as St. Kitts and Nevis and St. Vincent and the Grenadines actually being in the top 10 countries in the world in 2017 in terms of the homicide rate. Chapter 4 also speaks to some uncomfortable truth. And these are some of the truths that we are often afraid to confront as legislators, as academicians, as Caribbean residents. The fact is that there's a nexus between murder, fraud, theft, assault, and drugs, as well as the drug trade. Professor Griffith also submits that Caribbean countries with the highest rates of crimes are also those with the highest rates of drug involvement. The crucible of crime in the Caribbean is marked by high murder rates, daring and dastardly criminal acts, heinous crimes, the proliferation of guns, notably high-powered assault rifles, wanton killing of children and elderly persons, guns as a choice of weaponry. In fact, our recent research has shown that approximately 75 to 85% of all crimes or all homicides committed in the Caribbean they're conducted using firearms. And the question I often ask, and in fact I ask to my students, when was the last time that you heard someone was stabbed to death? Mainly it's people are being shot and killed. We also have random killing of innocent bystanders who are viewed as collateral damage, as well as local gang rivalries facilitated in part by transnational organized crime. So let me now wrap up. I remember Major Lynch saying that he's the time police, so I would not want to run afoul of the time police. So in closing, in the book Macrocriminology and Freedom, John Griffith speaks to the importance of understanding and addressing social challenges in the contemporary era, while challenging us as a people to become increasingly relevant by making connections that are often overlooked, by committing to activist social sciences aimed at crime reduction, and to use that scholarship to enhance our freedoms. Professor Griffith, I have no doubt that you have heeded that call made by John Griffith. In fact, your book speaks not to only understanding, but also addressing social challenges of drugs and crime throughout the region. In so doing, Professor Griffith, you have continued your undying commitment to activist social sciences aimed at crime reduction by way of knowledge production to enhance our freedoms. Thank you, Professor Griffith, for your timely and topical scholarly intervention. By way of this scholarly production, you have enhanced in my mind, that we in the Caribbean are a frontistery for knowledge production and transference. Thank you.
You are free to use the other two mics, so perhaps you can avail yourselves to them. Okay, great. Joseph?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. First, I must say it's an absolute honor to be seated next to Professor Griffith. Having listened to all the contributions thus far, it actually encourages me to continue the work that we are doing in the region as it relates to bolstering cyber resilience. Because the book that you have produced certainly would add value or map into, feed into the systems that we currently are developing at CARICOM Impacts to bolster cyber resilience. And please bear with me as I would focus primarily on cybersecurity and cybercrime issues, because that's kind of up my alley. But certainly, when you spoke earlier, you spoke about lack of reporting and the underreporting, sorry. And that speaks to legislation to compel organizations and institutions to report cyber activity. Earlier this year and mid last year, CARICOM Impacts did a series of sensitization workshops throughout the region. And the Prime Minister of Grenada made a very resounding statement. And it keeps hitting home today tonight as I sat in the audience. If there's no law, there's no crime. And I want to say that again. If there's no law, there's no crime. How do we classify crime? Technology-based crimes is critical. How do we map with what is happening globally? And in your book, I must say, I understand why it took 13 years to complete, because I could tell you the work in the region to get statistics for cyber-related activity is very, very challenging and even onerous. So I applaud you on that as well. And I could tell you that your research will certainly be used to bolster what we're doing in the region. I'm happy to see that in your delivery, you spoke about the vested interests of cybersecurity in the major upcoming event, which is the Cricket World Cup, the T20 Cricket World Cup. So in that regard, we would have partnered with Cricket West Indies to provide training to our law enforcement officials or judiciary professionals and our national cybersecurity incident response teams, all with a view of bolstering our security mechanisms leading up to the event. And certainly your research would add value to what to securing the event and by extension making it a success. Additionally, the synergies between and even the differences between what is cybersecurity and cybercrime investigation is clearly defined and outlined in your book, sir. And that is no easy task, because in this region, and I'm not knocking the professionals, we tend to mix and overlap what cybersecurity is and what cybercrime is. So I'm happy to see that my thought process is echoed in the document here as well. So that being said, I don't want to overstay. I'm seated, so I'll try to be short as well. At CARICOM Impacts, we are passionate about issues concerning crime and security, and certainly issues of financial crimes, the overlap with financial crimes and cybersecurity, digital transformation, as you, Mr. Lynch, alluded to, is held together by the cybersecurity thread. So certainly this book would be used as a tool to aid in those processes. what I'd like to add as well, I'm hoping that this publication would motivate governments, institutions, and individuals in the region to uptake the mechanisms that are being developed and that are currently existing within the region, so that we could all bolster cyber resilience. And to me, that's how everything would map, and that's how this piece of research would compound what is already being done. I'm tempted to go a bit further because currently we are updating in the region something known as the CARICOM Cybersecurity and Cybercrime Action Plan, which is a 2016 document that was signed off by heads of government, which provides a roadmap for developing cyber resilience within our member states. And certainly I could say here, and I know my colleagues and the Assistant Executive Director could speak to that as well, this document would add value to that process. So thank you very much. And in closing, I guess the applause means that I'm babbling on. But in closing, sir, I think publications like these really drive home the need to understand that there's no crime that cannot be perpetrated or investigated without the use of technology. So certainly, this book is well received from on our end, and I congratulate you once more. Thank you very much.
Well, last but certainly not least, want to invite Ambassador Philip Spencer to give his comments this time. Sure.
I feel like an impact player in IPL. Good evening. I arrived after the protocol had been established, and I think I would not want to fail to seize the opportunity to acknowledge the President of the Senate, Honorable Minister, the distinguished I'm not sure how I should refer to the judge. I could possibly speak for an hour in terms of my regard and respect for you, but always a pleasure to see you. I recognize as well distinguished colleagues, heads of divisions and agencies in the Ministry of National Security, and other distinguished colleagues. I see Dr. Montut. And here on the panel that I've been co-opted to join, I am pleased to acknowledge and endorse fully the comments offered by Dr. Wallace, Sir Joseph, and Ms. Spicer. But tonight is all about Dr. Ivelaw, Lloyd, Griffith. And, earlier, I think it was Ms. Spicer, in characterizing the value of the work of Dr. Griffith, she implored that we recognize the stature of this international scholar. I won't attempt to repeat the already very insightful comments made, but I would share a little bit. I understand that you pointed out I was there at the beginning. Well,
I talked about the role you played in this book in 1990.
Yes, thank you.
You took my son who is there. I don't think
Yeah.
you've seen him since.
So I'm figuring it out from the resemblance. But I've long been a student of security, of strategic security and geopolitics. And on the matter of security, at whichever level, and on the issues of sovereignty and legitimacy and credibility. We often refer to giants, scholarly giants like James Rosno. We'd refer to Barry Busan, we'd refer to John Rapley and a host of others who laid the foundations for understanding the importance of the nexus between security and sovereignty. But I think we also need to acknowledge the very fundamental and seminal role played by Dr. Griffith from his earliest publications in introducing elements of our security reality in this region that regrettably had perhaps escaped some of the other giants, not being able, of course, to speak with the legitimacy or write with the legitimacy that he has coming from our own region. In our region, if I had to identify three very specific characteristics that are both structural and systemic, I would have to offer, and I admit, and this is perhaps where Professor Griffith mentions my having followed him from the beginning. The issues of vulnerability, transnationality, and multidimensionality. I'm sure for anyone who would have been reading not only this most recent publication, but publications from Professor Griffith ever since, you would recognize that it is because of Professor Griffith that those three characteristics of our particular regional security landscape, he has made those three characteristics more real than I think anyone else could. So it's no surprise that the concept of multidimensionality explains across the spectrum of crime and security challenges that our region has faced. It explains the extent to which our region, principally small states, principally small island states, principally a region where our maritime space far outstrips our land territory, is so easily susceptible to the vulnerabilities that come with our circumstance. I've joined this quick discourse, and I know I don't want to speak for too long. I couldn't be prepared to speak for too long. I am the number 11 batsman, asked to make an impact. Grateful. But I want to highlight, as I conclude, in adding to the recognition of the value of Professor Griffith's work over the years, and particularly this issue of challenges to our sovereignty. Three other features that I hope we begin to give greater attention to as we try to overcome our challenges. In 2003, I think it was, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, speaking at the Institute of International Relations in St. Augustine. That's Prime Minister Gonzalez. He made reference to sovereign interests, not sovereign states, sovereign interests. And our region has been buffeted by a number of sovereign interests. I think drugs is a sovereign interest. It comes with its own sovereignty. It imposes, as it were, its own sovereignty on our circumstance. What has been happening with the flow of guns has in fact assumed, as it were, has its own, seems to have its own sovereign characteristics. But what has made it worse for us what I think Professor Griffith highlights here are these three things. It is the extractive impact of those threats in our region in terms of economic value, social value, political value, and at the end of the day, the psyche of our region. The psyche of our region has been affected by the extractive character of the challenges to our sovereignty. But it's not only extractive. We have also faced a number of exploitative challenges and threats. When we look at the range of economic crimes and the value chains that have somehow or the other very well organized structures of organized criminal enterprise, they have been exploitative. Finally, there's been a measure of exhaustiveness. They've almost exhausted in some areas the capacities of some of our countries to really stand and challenge the threats that we face. And so you go back to the three dominant characteristics of vulnerability, transnationality, and multidimensionality of our reality. How do we therefore find a way to face challenges to our sovereignty that are as exhaustive, extractive, and exploitative as the ones we face, while at the same time accepting and acknowledging the limits that could be placed on us by the fact that our countries are located in a place where we are inescapably exposed to transnationality, and we are inescapably exposed to the multidimensionality of the threats that we face. I think what Professor Griffith has done here is not only to unmask further the challenge, but challenge us also at the end of the day to embrace what I refer to as our self-validation in our capacity to overcome these challenges. I think it is a timely call for us to do the deep introspection and consider how we must, let me use this term, engage in dilemma flipping to see how transnationality can be leveraged so that we retain or regain where we may have lost our sovereignty, and at the end of the day, be able to offer our people the peace, productivity, and prosperity that I think unquestionably we have talent and capacity to provide for ourselves. So I look forward to joining with you and spending more time and delving into every page in the publication. I have the highest regard for Professor Griffith. He is our James Rosano. He is our Barry Busan. All of those great thinkers on the issue of security that we have studied, we don't need to look too far. Right here from our region is our own Professor Lloyd Ivelaw Griffith. Professor Griffith, thank you for co-opting me to join the team. And I wish you all the best going forward. Thank you.
So, Prof, you have 2 minutes to respond to 4 contributions.
Let the church say amen. Let the church say amen.
Amen.
Let the church say amen.
Amen.
That's 3. I think it remains only for me to do 2 things. And one is to express the hope that the journey that will have ended with this publication will be viewed as part of a relay for other scholars and practitioners. And one of the things that I've prided myself with over the years is encouraging Caribbean security professionals to write. You go to Leavenworth, you go to Mons, you go to other places, document your experiences, help to chart the course of the circumstances in your jurisdictions in the region. So I'm hoping that one or several individuals will view this as part of a relay. Take the baton and move on. Here's my second observation. My second observation is to express the hope that more Caribbean policymakers pay attention to the circumstances of a region by people who are in the region. Sometimes you get the impression that the validation of our folks is only accepted if somebody else validates that book. That circumstance has to change. If those circumstances of validation through the validation of others do not change, we risk giving credence to something that Kwame Nkrumah said way back in 1954. That the greatest threat to decolonization is decolonization of the mind. We are still capturing a sense of the people who colonize us that says, you have got to take legitimate notice of your own people through the eyes of somebody else. And until and unless we're able to move beyond that paradigm, challenging though it may be, we're going to find ourselves in a circularity of a pretense to decolonization. And the pretense to decolonization is adequately reflected in the challenged sovereignty notion. For a number of years, I was a visiting scholar at the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. And I remember still, it was about 2 decades ago, one of the Caribbean security courses, an official from this region, from the Eastern Caribbean, was complaining about the hypocrisy of his own minister. They're coming to Washington to sign an important document. The minister was only recently elected. The minister who didn't have any competence in the portfolio he was assigned didn't want to embarrass himself by reading any material in preparation for this important meeting. So here is an official, a senior official saying to me, Professor Griffith, how do I get my political officials to take this business seriously and not really sell out our sovereignty by going and simply signing this document? It may be a circumstance that is far and few in relation to Trinidad is concerned, but it's a harsh reality still of so many jurisdictions in this region where we pay no attention to our own folks. Here is this was a permanent secretary who's saying to the minister we should get together and then, think I want anybody to know he studied that stuff, man. You know. Sovereignty can continue to be a pretense unless we decolonize some of the minds in the region. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to make 2 very quick observations before we go into the book presentations. The first is, I'm reliably informed that the virtual attendance is still quite high, which would suggest that there is quite a lot of international attention, interest, what we are discussing here tonight, this evening. The second observation that I want to make is as a former policy practitioner, I'm quite certain that those who are working to threaten the sovereignty of this region have just gone to work this time of the evening. We have to outwork them. We have to outthink them. So this is quality work. This is quality work. Let's give the panelists another round of applause. Okay, so we are at the book presentation stage. So may I ask the panelists to return to your seats at this time? And we are moving to a quick conclusion. The first set of persons that are scheduled to have the photographs with Professor Griffith, may I ask the Honorable Senator Freitas to kindly join us here for a photograph. Certainly the Minister of National Security, the Honorable Fitzgerald Hines, sir, please. Oh, well, so we are guided by the persons in charge of the photography. Okay. Careful.
You know, sometimes the lawyers tell us that there's some unwritten rules. Here is an unwritten rule. Everyone who receives a complimentary copy of this book is obligated to buy 10 copies for their audience. No, you don't have to stop at 10, you know. You can go to 25.
10 is the minimum.
But 10 is the minimum. Unwritten rule.
Okay, so next up is the Honorable Minister of National Security. Honorable Minister. All right. Okay, so next up is the fellow co-sponsors, Dr. Montoot, on behalf of the University of the West Indies. Okay. And Ms. Tanya Ayo, representative of the CARICOM Impacts. Last, but certainly not least, the President of the Caribbean Court of Justice. So when Professor Griffith suggested to the President of the Senate that he issues or he purchases 10 books, a couple of things that came to mind. The separation of powers in every sovereign country. And I thought that Professor Griffith, when we discussed who we wanted to present books to, all three were covered, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. So I think there's a commitment to buy 10 books from each area of separation of powers. And let's give them a round of applause. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that my task for this evening has come to an end. And I want to thank you for the kind courtesy of your attention. And I now hand over to Dr. Montoot, who will give the vote of thanks. Thank you very much.
Oh, what an amazing evening this was. Rich insights and discussions on such an important issue. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. So on behalf of the co-sponsors of this event, I would like to extend thanks to Professor Griffith for inviting us to partner with him for this book launch. I would like to acknowledge our chair, retired Major Richard Lynch, for the excellent job at moderating the event. Round of applause for him. Sincere appreciation to the Honorable Fitzgerald Hines, Minister of National Security, for his leadership, along with Major Richard Lynch and the team at the Ministry of National Security, including the Defense Force, the police services, and prison services for your collaboration and invaluable contributions. Thank you so very much. Many thanks to the CARICOM Implementation Agency for Crime and Security and the Caribbean Policy Consortium for their partnership on this initiative. Deepest gratitude to our speakers and presenters for your comments on the book. Your perspectives and insights were invaluable and certainly advanced the discussion on this very important subject of security and sovereignty. Special thanks to Professor Imbert and other colleagues at UTT for the venue and the accompanying infrastructural arrangements, especially Ms. Karen Tadier and Mr. Jeremy Alexis. Thank you so much. Our deepest gratitude to colleagues at the Institute of International Relations for their hard work and invaluable administrative support. Leading was Ms. Marian Ali Khan, supported by Ms. Sarah Hussein, Rachel Edwards, and other members of the IR Secretariat. Kudos to the IR IT team, Mr. John Maloney and Mr. Jonathan Singh. You did an excellent job. Special mention and thanks to the U.W.I Bookshop for managing the book sales today. Greatly appreciated. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the work of the Multimedia Production Center at the U.W.I St. Augustine campus for printing of the program. Thank you everyone for coming, and thanks for your patience. Thanks for your interest, and thanks for collaborating with us and for participating in this very important event. I now invite you to the lobby to mingle and participate and partake in some refreshments. Thank you very much and have a very enjoyable evening.
Ivelaw.